Beck Weathers could hear the others arguing close by, the words clipped and urgent, too broken to follow. Someone's gloved hand squeezed his shoulder as if to prove he was still there. Then the grip slipped away. Boots crunched. The rope shifted as people moved downhill. Beck tried to stand, and his legs folded like they belonged to someone else. He sat back into the snow, breath coming in short, ragged pulls, and listened as the last footsteps faded. He told himself they'd come back. It was May 10th, 1996, and Beck was high on Mount Everest near the balcony, alone, nearly blind, and slipping into hypothermia. He was 49, a pathologist from Texas, a husband and father climbing with Rob Hall's adventure consultants on a commercial expedition from Nepal. He had trained for years, chasing big peaks and the promise that a guided team could manage the hazards. But the higher he climbed, the more Everest stripped away the things he relied on: strength, clarity, time. That morning, before sunrise, Beck's eyesight had started to fail. He had undergone radial keratotomy, an older vision correction procedure that left his eyes vulnerable at extreme altitude. As the day brightened, glare off the snow turned the world into a washed-out blur. Edges vanished, depth disappeared. He could no longer trust what he was seeing on steep ground where one wrong step could mean a fall he wouldn't survive. He blinked hard, rubbed at his eyes with thick gloves, and tried to focus on the fixed line cutting upward into white. Rob Hall wanted Beck to descend to Camp 4, but Beck believed his vision might improve when the sun rose higher. He asked to wait. Hall agreed to that compromise and told him to clip into the fixed rope at the balcony and stay there until Hall returned on the way down. Beck obeyed. He stood in place, listening to oxygen regulators hiss and climbers' boots scrape by, expecting it to be minutes, maybe an hour. Above him, the summit push slowed to a crawl. Ropes that should have been in place were not, and climbers queued at choke points while time bled away. Every delay meant more oxygen used, more fatigue, more exposure. Beck stayed clipped in, fighting dizziness and cold, staring into a bright blankness he could barely interpret. Hours passed, and Hall never came back. By afternoon, conditions turned hard and dangerous. Wind increased and clouds swallowed the upper mountain. Snow began to fall. Descending climbers moved in clumps, exhausted, low on oxygen, fighting confusion. Beck finally started down with guide Mike Groom, who short-roped him to keep him from wandering off the route he could barely see. Beck's feet felt clumsy. His hands, already numb, struggled to manage carabiners. He leaned into Groom's tension on the rope, like a man walking on a narrow bridge with no rails. As they descended toward the South Col, the storm thickened into a blizzard, and the slope became a white field with no horizon. The trail disappeared. Fixed ropes were buried or missed. The distance to Camp 4 was not far, but on Everest, not far can become impossible when visibility drops and the body begins to shut down. Groups of climbers bumped into each other in the whiteout, then lost each other again. Someone would shout, another voice would answer, and then the wind would erase it. Beck became part of one of those groups, guides and clients from multiple teams, including Yasuko Namba, lost in the storm, stumbling, stopping, starting again, unable to find Camp 4, even though it was close. They drifted across the South Col, circling, missing the cluster of tents by yards, then by more. Their breathing turned frantic and shallow. The cold stopped feeling sharp and started feeling heavy, pressing into bone. When people finally stopped, it wasn't a decision. It was collapse. Later, Stuart Hutchison, a client who had turned around before the summit, went back out into the storm to look for the missing. He found Beck and Namba alive but barely responsive, frostbitten and in severe hypothermia. Beck could not stand. He could not walk. His face was stiff and swollen. His hands were useless. Hutchison tried to rouse him, to pull him upright, but Beck's body would not cooperate. The people in camp were themselves depleted. Low on oxygen, low on strength, struggling just to keep the tents anchored and the weakest climbers breathing. After a brutal assessment, they concluded they could not move Beck in time and could not stay without risking more deaths. Beck was left where he lay. In the night, his body cooled even further. Breathing slowed, heart rate dropped. The mountain became quiet except for wind and the snap of fabric in the dark. Beck's hands froze solid inside his gloves. His cheeks and nose went numb. His mind drifted in and out, catching on single images, his wife, his children, then losing them again. At times he wasn't sure if his eyes were open or closed. Sometime later he woke. Hypothermia had slowed him to the edge of death, but it also lowered the demands of his body just enough to keep him from crossing it. Beck's first clear thought was simple: move. He forced his legs under him and stood, swaying. He could not feel his fingers. His eyes were swollen nearly shut. His face was blackened by frostbite. The pain wasn't sharp, it was distant, as if it belonged to someone else. But he started walking, step after step, guided by instinct and the faint shape of terrain he remembered. When he stumbled into Camp 4, the people there stared like they were seeing a ghost. Beck Weathers had returned on his own, from a place everyone believed he would die. They dragged him into a tent and tried to rewarm him. Oxygen hissed. Someone pressed warm hands to his face and then recoiled at the feel of frozen skin. He was alive, but his injuries were catastrophic. Then, on May 11th into May 12th, another storm hit the South Col. Tents collapsed under wind and snow. The camp became chaos. People fighting canvas, trying to keep supplies from blowing away, trying to keep the weak from freezing. Beck's tent went down, and in the scramble of survival, he was again assumed dead. Once again, he was left behind. And once again, he got up. He crawled and staggered through the camp until he was seen and pulled in. This time, there was no room for doubt. He was still alive, and the only way to keep him that way was to get him off the mountain. Evacuation required getting him lower, where a helicopter could operate. Beck was brought down and then flown out, a rare rescue in the thin air of the Himalayas. He was taken to Kathmandu and then transported home to Texas. The damage Everest had done could not be undone. Both hands were amputated. His right arm was amputated to the elbow. He lost his nose and required extensive reconstruction to his face. Infection threatened him as his body fought to heal tissue that had been frozen beyond recovery. Rehab was slow, painful, and relentless. Beck learned to eat, dress, and function again using prosthetics and repetition. The physical loss was obvious, but the weight carried by his family was just as real. Days of believing he was dead, then the shock of seeing him return changed. Survival did not reset his life. It demanded that he rebuild it. Beck Weathers was left for dead on Everest and still walked back. Twice, people looked at him and decided he could not be saved. Twice, he proved them wrong with the only thing he had left: the ability to stand up and move. Thank you for listening to Horrifying Survival Stories. Subscribe for more stories of those who faced the impossible and lived.